Okay, we left off yesterday or day before yesterday with roads, canals, and railroads. Did you guys have any questions here about any of the content we covered from last class? We kept that lecture under 25 minutes. Is that good for you guys? Like I said, I'm not going to lecture you to death, but I gotta teach, right? We talked about how canals, railroads, and improved roads. You remember the name of the improved road with gravel and shale? Name for the inventor? Macadam. Good job. The Macadam Road is going to improve. You guys brought up a really good point about how to pay for it. There were tolls at this period of time. There were tax dollars that were begrudgingly paid. You don't see large federal subsidies, but what you do see is large federal land grants and even state land grants. And you got private capital, guys like Cornelius Vanderbilt come on the scene here prior to the Civil War and decide to invest their money into the railroad. If you want to look back to your earliest railroad tracks, you can look in the 1820s, but the period in which the railroad, pun intended, takes off is going to be in 1830. There's a widely publicized race between a horse and Peter Cooper's Tom Thumb. The horse wins because the Tom Thumb has a belt that breaks, but that changes the mindset of a lot of people who were hesitant to invest. We also left off talking about the gauge of tracks, the interconnection of tracks. The North is going to become more interconnected with their railroads across state lines as opposed to the South. You have more like destinations in the South for commodities, like if they needed to move cotton or if they needed to move iron, for example, like Allegheny Railroad will be established to move iron. And there'll be southern railroads like railroad heads coming out of Atlanta to move cotton and other crops. And do we get to this map, or is that when we, okay. This is where we definitely left off. This is just a 10-year period, and these census records, I'm going to refer in the next couple of lessons to a lot of the 1850 and 1860 maps and census records. In a 10-year period, you can see that both north and south, their railroads are going to grow, but these northern routes become so interconnected because of the land grants, but also because of the private investment. Vanderbilt is going to create a rail race during this period of time to interconnect major cities like Chicago and New York, which will ultimately become the Grand Central, and Erie Railroad, a number of others that interconnect. Where the South, even though more rail centers grow, you are really seeing most of like the major cities in the South, urban areas, which are not many, connected, and as I said before, agriculture connecting from rural areas to southern seaport centers. You guys have any questions here? All right. Northern farm productivity is going to increase, and I don't care if you take notes in the margins here. You can highlight, you can take notes on your own paper. I trust your judgment. Whatever you feel most comfortable with. So your northern farm productivity will increase while, despite the fact that labor will fall off, but keep in mind that your northern labor is free labor. That doesn't mean that these people are treated right. We do have to keep that in perspective. There are no child labor laws. There's no Children's Bureau. In fact, the earliest unionization is occurring at this period of time, and it's very much, it's very small at this period of time. It's not, we're not looking at major union movements until the post-war era on farms or in industry. We've already talked about the improved transportation thanks to canals, steamboats, railroads, improved roads, and turnpikes. Some of the technological innovations during this era: steel plow, steel drill, harrows. You're all familiar with what harrows do? Harrows are kind of like it's like an early sort of bush hog. You familiar with what a bush hog is? It kind of like clears out fields. That's what an early harrow was. Then the cultivator will come a little bit later. The reaper, though, is the big one. The reaper and the cotton gin are the two big innovations for agriculture. Because what the mechanical reaper does is it increases the productivity of every farmer across the country. And the reaper also is going to be sold internationally. Does anybody know where the reaper was invented? Probably passed it many, many times. Anybody ever gone down to Blacksburg before? The Virginia Tech game, gone to Roanoke, visit family? Anybody ever gone to Lexington? Okay. If you've gone down Route 81, you've passed the McCormick Reaper Farm, or the McCormick Farm, where the reaper was invented by Cyrus McCormick, Joe Anderson, one of his slaves, who was more of an assistant to him, sort of an apprentice. And this harvester, where is it going to be mass produced though? Certainly not in the Shenandoah Valley. Up north. Northwest, actually. That's a really good guess. What would be a city where you think this might be produced? They could get the reaper out to the west, north. Chicago. Chicago. Nice. Is that what you guys said? Oh, I thought you guys said Chicago. All right. You did? Fantastic. Well done. Okay. So another thing that I want to point out that I have later in the lesson, and it might not be in this lesson, it might be in the next lesson, another really important technological innovation that connects to labor and farming and communication is the telegraph. It allows America to become the most informed nation in this era. We'll talk more about the importance of the telegraph later. So we've got northern agriculture that is going to be a massive moneymaker. And it's going to lead to not just the growth of this nation, but it's going to lead to international growth. The United States becomes a global player in terms of trading agricultural commodity both north and south. Here we have an image of the 1847 McCormick Reaper. And if you ever have an opportunity, you can visit the McCormick farm. It's owned by Virginia Tech now. Yeah.
You were talking about the agricultural field. They didn't have any refrigeration at this time, so how did they stop the
They actually was the original refrigerator is invented by this time. They lined it with zinc and tin, but any agriculture that's being moved overseas they're going to just have to keep shoveling ice into the area to get it moving.
Well, like, how could they import overseas? Because like this time this would be like 6-week road trip to Europe.
Right.
How?
No. Steam power, the trip's 2 weeks now, and in some cases a week. So yeah, that timeline is advanced, and we're not too far off at this point. Back to the refrigerator. Like if you had a refrigerated ice box, it's not like refrigeration in the post-war era. But still, it could keep crops like corn on a week to 2 week trip. Obviously, the biggest moneymaker moving overseas is going to be tobacco, and the number one moneymaker is going to be cotton. And leading up to the war, somewhere around 75% of European cotton is coming from the American South. And then I'm going to get a little ahead of myself here, but any other questions there? That's a really great question, Andrew. All right, so we talked a little bit about the industrialization class before last. We're going to see that industrial revolution in England occur at the turn of the 19th century. And we see the American industrial growth, most especially after the War of 1812, because those embargo acts are and the non-intercourse acts that we learned about are gonna fade away. Those are the ones that limited trade with England and France prior to the War of 1812. I believe I brought this up. England had attempted to pass laws, and they did pass laws to prevent their patents and technological secrets from making their way to America, but you can only do so much to keep these innovative minds in the UK. So guys like Samuel Slater and a number of other British engineers and business owners are going to leave England and come to America and set up shop. Samuel Slater opens up his textile mill in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. Francis Lowell opens up his textile mill in Lowell, Massachusetts. Both of these mills are tremendously successful. Francis Lowell is not British. He was born in Massachusetts. The textile production, though, is going to grow rapidly because of new innovations in that line of work. And those innovations are invented in the late 1700s in England. Two of these really important inventions are the spinning jenny for weaving, and you might want to make note of that, because I don't think that is in that set of notes. I added that for you. And then the powered loom for looming. Not to mention that you've got to set the factory up near fast-moving water. So that's why a lot of these are going to be established in the Northeast. I'm sure many of you are thinking, well, what about steam power? Yes, steam power will be used, but not on a large scale. In these early mills, it's going to be physical mill, the use of mills and a system of pulleys. And I did not include that image on your notes, but I did put the image up here for you guys, and we'll break that down a little bit. So the New England and the Northeast is going to dominate the textile production. This is where tariffs become an issue. Now, tariffs had been around since Hamilton served as the first Secretary of Treasury. But we know that prior to the War of 1812 and after the War of 1812, Northerners support tariffs because it protects their industry. And you guys did a good job last class of identifying what tariffs are. They're taxes on imports. The South, not so keen on this. They want to be able to move their goods to market quickly, because we talked last class about that perpetual mercantile system that the South is stuck in. They are required to move their goods before those goods rot on the docks. I thought Andrew brought up a good point here. Is the North moving agricultural commodities abroad? Of course they are, but not on the level that the South is, because the South is not an industrial producing region. The South's industrial production is limited to city centers like Richmond, and Danville, and Atlanta, and Memphis, and New Orleans, Charleston. Not really, though. Still mainly a seaport center. A little bit about the Slater and Lowell mills, especially the Lowell mills. They dominated the cotton textile factory system. They employed young girls. They called them Lowell girls. They provided housing and supervision, but the Lowell girls who were your age, they led one of the earliest unionization movements in American history. I'm sure a lot of you are out there like, boo unions. But if I were your boss and it was 1848 and I told you I was cutting your wages by 25% and I was going to extend your workday by 2 hours, you guys might come together, right? Or if I said, hey, I'm cutting your wages, I'm extending your workday, and we're getting rid of the housing, you're definitely going to come together. Okay? So you have to, I don't care whether you love or hate unions, and I'm not trying to, I will always tell you, I don't have like some socialistic agenda here, but you have to look through the eyes of these individuals who were not only prohibited of learning how to read and write and getting an education, they had to secretly learn as they worked. But on top of that, they were fighting basically for survival because many of them, women and men, didn't have the rights and they were too young to have the rights. And even if they did reach a certain age, the women weren't going to have the same rights as the men when they came of age. I think this is pretty incredible, this statistic, and this is in the book as well, in the first chapter. The New England textile mill output, 4 million yards in 1817, 308 million yards in 1837. This allows the U.S. to compete internationally in terms of textiles. This also heightens, and if you look at this period of time, you look at the 1820s, late 1820s, into the late 1830s, that's where that tariff crisis is happening, where people are freaking out about the tariff. Not to mention, there's another thing that happens in 1837 that might send up a flag that we'll talk a little bit about later too. Y'all remember a significant event that occurred in 1837 in terms of American economics last year? You guys remember the Panic of 1837? Like one of the worst economic depressions in American history, and that has consequences, right? Because the United States is stuck in a very difficult position. The U.S. banking system doesn't exist anymore. The state banks and private banks have fallen apart. People want to trade internationally, but they also want to protect their own domestic production as well. So we'll talk more about that as we move forward. Any questions here? I did not include this in your notes, but I thought this was kind of a cool little image. This was in a book that, oh man, we haven't used it in a long time, but I thought this was cool. It was a book done by National Geographic years ago, and it just shows you what that mill system looked like and how every floor had a different job. You had your looming floor, you had your spinning floor, shows you how your mill wheel technology worked, and then those belts and pulley systems. This is also a very dangerous work environment. You get a hand caught in a pulley, you get a hand caught in a machine, there's no workers' comp. Okay? This is what we would call limited what? Liability. Awesome. Limited liability. That's what the Lowell mills looked like from the outside. All right, a little bit about American mechanization. We talked about these machines coming over from Britain, two of which, the spinning jenny and the power loom. Mass production is going to be key to America being able to produce a number of products. And there's a really awesome section in chapter 1 of the book that talks about patents that, you know, in the 1780s, the patents were in the hundreds, and by the 1830s, the patents were in the thousands in the United States. So this is an era of innovation. One of the most significant patents that was definitely manipulated was the 1791 to 93 cotton gin produced by Eli Whitney. Does anybody remember that whole story? Okay, Eli Whitney comes down from the north, Connecticut, wants to invent a machine to get rid of slavery. The plan ironically backfires because the cotton gin is not seen as a way to decrease the, again, not need, but want for slavery. It increases it. Because what a cotton gin could do in one day would take 50 slaves to do in a day. So tragically, the demand for slaves and the price of slaves go up. Not what Eli Whitney had in mind. All right? In addition to the cotton gin, Eli Whitney develops interchangeable parts. The earliest mechanisms for interchangeable parts: clocks, firearms, the cotton gin itself, and then other manufactured goods. This is revolutionary. What would have been done, I'm using a little quote from Andrew Carnegie here, what would have been done at the hearth now can be done through mass production. What I mean by that is, prior to the interchangeable parts of a gun maker, you would have hired a gunsmith and that would have been custom made. And if maybe your trigger or your hammer on your weapon cracked or broke, you'd have to go back to that gunsmith, and that gunsmith would have to repair it, or another gunsmith would have to repair it. Whereas interchangeable parts between Eli Whitney and Samuel Colt got on the ground running with interchangeable parts and assembly line production. And I know we credit Henry Ford for assembly line production. Yeah, he was using assembly line production for the automobile, but assembly line production was being used in this era in America. Colt and Whitney come together, and Colt is going to mass produce guns, and you can buy these interchangeable parts and potentially fix the gun yourself. This is also going to have a major impact on both the Union and Confederate armies when they start using mass production for their weapons at places like Springfield, Massachusetts, and Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, Virginia. Interchangeable parts are going to also be applied to larger pieces of technology: steam engines, locomotives, reapers, powered looms. So here we have Eli Whitney on the left, Samuel Colt on the right. We'll talk more about weaponry later. I know some of you guys might be into the weaponry of this era. You will not be disappointed. We'll be covering that a bit later. Any questions about that? How are we doing on time, guys? 1 minute? All right, let's wrap up with urbanization. So urbanization is going to be considered, and I want you to take this note down. I added this note for you, and that's a good point of reference. Urbanization, defined by the Census Bureau in 1820. Is everybody familiar with the census? Come around every 10 years, find out who you are, what you're doing, how many kids you have, because we want records of that so we can research that over time. And we will be looking at some census records this year. think that's an important skill for us to walk away with. And there's my time. I'm going to let you jot this note down, and what we'll do is we will continue on with urbanization, and I intend to wrap up lesson 1 on Tuesday. Any questions for me? You guys feeling good? Fantastic. All right. Yeah. You sure can.